Shalom, everybody. Greetings from the holy city of Jerusalem. In today's video, I would like to start a new series of classes on the history of the Kabbalah. Recently, I have finished teaching a whole course about this subject to my students privately, and I have decided to start making a few videos publicly for the benefit of many people in the English-speaking world that would like to benefit and to learn a little bit more about the history, the development, the origins of what we call Kabbalah. We will explain what is Kabbalah, what is the origin. We will speak about different historical periods, main texts, rabbinical figures. So I intend to make a series of videos about it. In order to clarify, I don't think there is anything like this in English. So I think it's a great project to accomplish. I also noticed that on the other series of videos that I was making about inner space, a work published by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, there's a few people who found that very helpful and very interesting. So far, we only did like 5 classes. I just want to let you know that eventually I do intend to continue with the learning of that book, that Sefer, Inner Space, because I think it's also a good material for those who want to get into the subject of Jewish mysticism, Jewish magic, the history of the Kabbalah. So I think that book is a good introductory book material, basic, medium level that will benefit many people. But I think it's also essential to do a series of classes, a series of videos explaining historically the development of what we call today Kabbalah. There's a lot of people who hear about it, there's a lot of people who speak about it and probably don't even know what this means. They don't have, they cannot locate historically what are we talking about, what period, what places, who were these great rabbis, who were these great mystics. I think it's important to clarify all these concepts. In today's class, I would like to do an introduction about the origins of Jewish mysticism before even to what we call today Kabbalah, because in the old days it was not called like this. It had different names. I would like to explain a little bit going back from the time of the prophets of Israel and what was happening in the Jewish world in the first century and even before that. First of all, I would like to start with a clarification of what do we mean by the term Kabbalah. Kabbalah comes from the Hebrew root kaval or lekavel, which means to receive, meaning by definition, someone who learns Kabbalah is someone who is receiving a knowledge, who is receiving a wisdom, who is receiving a tradition from a master. Meaning, by definition, Kabbalah is not something that you can learn on your own, but you need a rabbi, a master Kabbalist that will teach you the secrets of the Kabbalah. Because he himself received it from his master, and his master from another master, and from someone else, and from someone else. So it's a chain that goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, all the way back to Sinai, straight to God, from Hashem, from the creator of the world, that we call it in Kabbalah Ein Sof, the infinite, with limitless, no beginning, no end. This is how we refer to the divinity in Kabbalistic terminology. So, by definition, Kabbalah, lekavel, kaval means to receive, but not only to receive means that the person who is giving or passing this knowledge considers the student worthy enough to receive this knowledge. Otherwise, he wouldn't choose this person to give or to pass on this tradition, this secret wisdom to the person if he is not worthy. Therefore, we see there is a relationship between teacher and the student. Now, when we speak about the Kabbalah, there are 2 major themes. There is what we call the secrets of the Maase Bereshit, the mysteries of the creation, and there are the mysteries of the Maase Merkava, the workings of the chariot of fire. The Maase Bereshit deals with the first chapters of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, that deal with the creation of the world. So what the Mekubalim did is not only an analysis of the beginning chapters of the book of Genesis, but they also explain what happened before Genesis, before the Bereshit. The Maase Merkava deals with the vision of the prophet Yehezkel, the prophet Ezekiel, the vision of the throne of God, the Merkava, the chariot, and a deeper knowledge of how God runs the world. It deals with all the subjects of providence, angels, the different worlds, the different universes, what is the role of man in this world, and how to ascend from universe to universe, from level to level, to attach ourselves to the will of God. This is what we call devekut. There is a union with the divinity. In another mystical traditions, they call this unio mystica, which is the connection that the mystic has with God, with Akadosh Baruch Hu. So these are the two major themes when we speak about Kabbalah. Now, as I explained in the beginning, what we refer today as Kabbalah, this is not how it was called in the old days. Kabbalah is a term that, let's say that mainly from the Middle Ages, this word started to be associated specifically with Jewish mysticism. It appears, of course, in the Talmud, in the Gemara, but it means in general the idea of receiving a knowledge, the tradition, the teaching of the sages. So it could have a broader terminology or understanding when we look into the ancient Jewish sources and ancient Jewish texts. But specifically from the Middle Ages on, is that the term Kabbalah came to be associated specifically with the Jewish mystical tradition. Before that, what we call today Kabbalah had different names, like I said before. It was known as Yoel Haim Benhabib, those who descend to the chariot. As I explained, the goal of the mystic was to reach a state similar to the prophet Ezekiel. The goal of all the Mekubalim in the Middle Ages, before to the 1st century, the 2nd century, all this period, they were trying to achieve the vision of the Merkava, of the throne of God. And that's why we have different literature during that period. We call it a halot, that deals a lot with instructions, names of God, what we refer today as mantras, in which a person using one of the names of God, Shemot, and repeating the name multiple times, gets himself into a trance, into some type of mystical state, in which the mystic now is able to see the spiritual world. Specifically, the intention is to have a vision of the chariot of God, the throne of God, that is sitting on the throne. And that was the intent of the mystics during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. We have to say, people today, when they speak about Kabbalah, they think, oh, what is Kabbalah for? Okay, someone might say, okay, I just want to get closer to God. I want to understand the creation. I want to understand this. I want to understand that. That's all beautiful, but that's not the main purpose of learning Kabbalah. Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, one of the greatest Kabbalists ever, who lived in Spain in the 13th century, he wrote that the goal to learn Kabbalah is to become a prophet. Why? Because Kabbalah itself is the result, is the wisdom of the ancient prophets of Israel. Like I explained, according to the Mekubalim, the origin of Kabbalah goes all the way back to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu in Har Sinai, the Mount Sinai, when Moshe received the Torah from Hashem, he received not only the revealed aspect, but also the hidden aspect. And that hidden aspect, which is the 4th level of interpretation of the Torah, we call it the Sod, and Sod is Kabbalah. Therefore, this knowledge was passed from Moshe to Yoshua. Yoshua, also Moshe passed this knowledge to the 70 elders, to Aaron as well, and the 70 elders to the judges, to the prophets, and so on and so forth, to the members of the Great Assembly, and so to the members of the Sanhedrin, and so it continued generation after generation until our very days. Therefore, there is a link, there is a chain of tradition that connects the knowledge of the Kabbalah all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Because the Mekubalim, the goal is to delve deeply into the learning of the Torah in order to unveil and to go deep into access the mysteries, the secrets, the realities that are hidden within the text. So we understand that after prophecy came to an end, this knowledge was passed down from the last prophets of Israel to the next generation, to the rabbis. And we will explain, B'ezrat Hashem, later on how this happened, the names, the process, all of this. So you have a context. What are we talking about? The Kabbalah is the secret wisdom from the prophets. And that's why the Chamim explain. The real goal to learn the Kabbalah is to become a prophet. And we know that by the time of the Messianic age, when the Mashiach comes, it says the prophecy will come back to the Jewish people. And that's why you have great Mekubalim, great rabbis, great mystics like Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, who created a whole school. It's the school of prophecy. And this is something that we will see, B'ezrat Hashem, in another class further on. So having this in mind, now we have an idea of what these mystics were trying to achieve. And that's why they were called Yoel Haim Benhabib, those who descend to the chariot. Later on, they were associated with different terminology, with different names. They were also known as Ba'alei Asod, the masters of the mystery. And this is a term that was used during the Talmudic period. They were also known as Anshei Emunah, the men of belief. We have that at a later period, during the time of the development of Spanish Kabbalah and the Kabbalah that appeared in southern France, in Provence, in Languedoc, the Kabbalists were known as those who possessed what we call Chokhmat Penimit, the inner wisdom, because they knew the hidden, the inner secrets of the Torah, like I explained before. They were also known as Maskilim, the understanding ones. This is actually a derivation that comes from the book of Daniel Navi, chapter 12, in which speaks about those who know the mysteries of God. So this is the reference to the Maskilim, meaning the Mekubalim, the Kabbalists. By the way, in Hebrew it's called Mekubal, singular, Mekubalim in plural. The Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, were also known as Dorshei Reshumot, those who interpret the text, as I explained before, going deeply into the mysteries of the Torah. So we see that there is a continuity from the time of the prophets to a later generation, and so on until our days. Therefore, we see that the knowledge, the secret knowledge of the prophets was not lost. We have that in the Jewish world, not everything is written. We have a very rich oral tradition. Later on, part of this oral tradition was written, that we call the Talmud, which is composed of the Mishnah and the Gemara, but not everything is written, because even to learn that the Talmud, you have to know a lot of oral techniques and methods. That's why you need to learn from a rabbi who also learned from someone else and someone else to really understand the dynamics and what is the proper method to learn this sacred text. But in the same way is with the learning of the Kabbalah. There are many things that are not written. And even though many books were published, you cannot understand the text unless you have a rabbi who is giving you and you receive. This is why it's called Kabbalah, lekavel, to receive, because the master, the rabbi, is the one who will open for you the brain. It will open for you the ability, the capacity to understand this knowledge. We have that the sages explain that after Shimon HaTzadik, the last of the members of the Anshei Knesset HaGedolah, the members of the Great Assembly, That was also the period of the beginning of the Sanhedrin. We're talking about in the 1st century. This knowledge passed to the great Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Hillel, the leaders of the Jewish people, were not only like community rabbis, but they were also masters of the secret. And that we have the Rabbi Hillel was one who possessed the knowledge of the Kabbalah. Rabbi Hillel had many students, but mainly I like to mention two of them, Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel and Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, two of the great transmitters, those who pass on the knowledge of the Kabbalah to the next generation. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai had a student. His name was Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah. Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah had a disciple, was known as Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had a disciple known as, or called, named Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar HaKadosh, the main text of the Kabbalah. So we see that we have a clear and defined chain of transmission of knowledge from generation to generation, of how this knowledge passed from master to disciple, and how in each generation there was more and more revelation of the knowledge. That in the beginning was very hidden, but eventually became more open and open until our days, that there is a lot of interest about this subject. Now, going back to one of the disciples of Rabbi Hillel, I'd like to speak briefly about Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel. Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel is a master by excellence, the main disciple of Rabbi Hillel, top student, the star of Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel is the one that we know from the tradition, is the one who was chosen to translate the books of the prophets from Hebrew to Aramaic. He was specially chosen for this important task because we know that Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel had a special link, a tradition that was passed down to him from the last three prophets of the Jewish people, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And that is why Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel was the one chosen to translate the book of the Nevi'im. This is known as a Targum. Targum Yonatan is usually known, which is the official translation, like I said before, of the books of the prophets. Not a simple person could have achieved this task, but someone who knew deeply not only the language, but also the inner hermeneutics, the mysteries that are concealed in the book of the Nevi'im. And this task was given to Rabbi Yonatan because he had this oral tradition from the last great prophets of the Jewish people, as I mentioned before. We know the greatness of Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel that the Chamim explain, and they say, look, the smallest of the disciples of Rabbi Hillel was Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, the sages say, he knew everything. He knew all the Torah, he knew the whole Tanakh, he knew, says, the language of the trees, the language of the birds, he knew the language of the angels. He was able to do great miracles, great things. And the sages explain, say, this is the smallest of the students of Rabbi Hillel. Now imagine the top student that was Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel. Imagine. The sages explain that Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, when he used to sit down to learn Torah, and there was a circle of fire around him constantly, to the point that if even a bird will fly over him, it will be consumed, combusted, as holocaust, immediately will burn and die, because it was a great fire protecting Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel. I had the zechut to visit his grave and to daven, to pray at the grave of Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel alongside my classmates here in the yeshiva. So I want to point out that there is a chain, there is a link, there is a tradition that is, as I explained, is passing from generation to generation. And as I said, we have that Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, the smallest of the students of Rabbi Hillel, had a disciple, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah. Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah had a disciple, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, I would like to speak briefly about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is not just known as one of the main transmitters of the Sefer Yetzirah. He's also the source for everything that we have in the Talmud, writes Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan in his book Meditation and Kabbalah, explaining the significance of Rabbi Akiva. Everything that we have comes from him, the source of all knowledge, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, the sages explain, was one of the four who entered the Pardes. Pardes meaning we're making reference to a meditative state in which the master of the Kabbalah tries to go into the upper chambers and to access the knowledge of the Almighty. But the Chachamim say, in order to access these secrets, you have to be like Rabbi Akiva, who not only knew all the mysteries of the Kabbalah, the hidden, the secret wisdom, but he also knew all of the Torah. He was the master of the hidden and the revealed Torah. Therefore, we have in Rabbi Akiva someone who had a balance. And this is something, there's a contrast here between Rabbi Akiva and the other four that the Talmud tells us that enter into what we call the Pardes. And there's a story about Rabbi Akiva ben Azai, Aher, which is Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, who's a great master of the Kabbalah, and Ben Zoma. One of them became crazy, one of them died, one became an apostate, and Rabbi Akiva was the only one who entered into the Pardes and came out in the same way. Therefore, the person who approaches the learning of the Kabbalah is facing different dangers. One, if you are not careful, you could die. If you are not careful, you can go crazy, because too much of the secrets of reality can make a person crazy. When you understand that all of this world is just basically not real, it's a lot of fake things happening in the world, and you have access to the reality behind the physical, your mind cannot handle it, you might go crazy. You might become an apostate, because if a person who is not trained and, let's say, reads a lot of things and he takes everything literally, he might think that things are just because you read something in a book, you think it's just the way it is, just because it's written. It doesn't work like that. You need to be like Rabbi Akiva. You go and get out in peace. It's important to go up, to receive a knowledge, but come down to the physical world, to reality, to work, to get married, to have children, to do things, to learn Torah, go to work, be normal, like Rabbi Akiva. So this is one of the dangers that the sages warn us about, going too deep into the mysteries without proper training, without a master. That's why it's important always to learn with someone who has experience, who is someone who has the chokhmah, who is accepted by all the mekubalim. It's something important I explained before. According to the Mishnah in Hagigah, says, and I quote, one cannot teach arayot, meaning sexuality, all of these teachings on sexuality, to more than two persons together. Says the Mishnah. One cannot teach Maase Bereshit, the secrets or the mysteries of the creation, to more than one person. One can only discuss Maase Merkava with one person who, in addition, must be wise and understanding, meaning he must have chokhmah, which is represented by the right brain. He must have bina, understanding, the left brain. So basically, you have here the requirements in the old days. This is how it was at the time of the sages, how a person needs to be balanced. A person needs to be wise, needs to have basic knowledge. Later on, we're going to explain what this means in the words of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. He explains this in his introduction to Kabbalah in the work Or Ne'erav. He explains what is the ideal age. He speaks about 20 years of age. He explains a lot of things here about how to approach the learning of the Kabbalah, the hidden wisdom. The sages explain also, when we speak about Maase Merkava, right? What is Maase Merkava? One of the greatest mysteries in the study of the Kabbalah. The Maase Merkava is not only accessing or having access to the vision or to the throne of God, to the chariot of fire, which is there's another discussion here if this is more like a symbolic or is real. What's going on? The Torah also speaks about the prophet Eliyahu Navi, who was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Speaks about there's different people who seem that they were taken up to Shamayim in a chariot of fire, and there's a lot of things to say about it. But basically, the Maase Merkava is also known as the discipline of grafting. What does it mean, grafting? Because it is through these disciplines that the person is able to graft himself onto the tree of life and going from madrega to madrega, from level to level, going up and up. Not to stay there, but as Jacob's ladder, to go up and to come down. He saw angels going up and angels coming down to earth. So a person must always access the higher wisdom and must come back, expand, contract. This is the secret to everything, for everything. It must be a balance in everything that a person does. I was explaining that there was a whole literature during this period, during the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, you have a lot of literature that deals what is known as a halot. And Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, explains, the great biblical commentator, he explains about the halot. And he says, when we speak about Maase Merkava, we make reference to what we call Pirkei Halot of Rabbi Ishmael. Who was Rabbi Ishmael? Rabbi Ishmael is one of the great masters of secrets during that time, during the 1st century. In the opinion of some, they identify him with the last Kohen Gadol. There's others who have a different understanding, maybe it's a different Rabbi Ishmael. The point is that at this time you have Rabbi Ishmael, who was one of the masters of the Kabbalah. He was the student of Rabbi Nehunia ben Akana. Rabbi Nehunia ben Akana is the one that the tradition says is the author of the Sefer Bahir, another of the main texts of the Kabbalah, Sefer Bahir. So far we have seen there are different books, and we will explain these in the next class in more detail about some of the main books of the Kabbalah. We mentioned the Zohar, we mentioned Sefer Yetzirah, we mentioned Sefer Bahir now. The Chamim explain, it seems that Sefer Bahir was composed between Rabbi Nehunia ben Akana and Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, the last of the, according to some, the last Kohen Gadol of the Jewish people. We know that Rabbi Akiva received the Merkava tradition from his rabbi, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, who was a sage from the 1st century, a great rabbi. He was the main disciple, as I mentioned, of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. Therefore, we see here a link of succession from rabbi to rabbi, passing this knowledge to the next generation. I said before that according to the majority of most serious scholars agree that the author of the Sefer Yetzirah is none other than Rabbi Akiva. I know that someone might say, okay, we hear that the Sefer Yetzirah was written by Abraham Avinu. Well, this is not the main understanding. It seems that this is a medieval idea that was developed because at the end of the Sefer Yetzirah, it ends with a reference to Abraham. So it seems that people start associating the name Abraham with the patriarch Abraham Avinu. But according to Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, in his book Inner Space, he explains and says that the research, the scholarly research points out that the author of the Sefer Yetzirah was Rabbi Akiva and his school. This is very important. This doesn't mean that Rabbi Akiva sat down himself and wrote with his own hand Sefer Yetzirah. No. During this time, the teaching was oral instruction. But the students of Rabbi Akiva were taking notes. And by the time that the Mishnah was compiled in the year 204 CE, it seems that the Sefer Yetzirah was also ready. And it seems that it is more or less the same form, the same version that we have until our very day. So we have that the Sefer Yetzirah was already known by this time and was passed down from Rabbi Akiva to his students who took notes, who wrote this down, and eventually these private notes that were later were known as hidden scrolls, Mekilot Setarim, were eventually put together, and we have what we call Sefer Yetzirah. Now, I explained before that the characteristic of the Jewish mystics during this period, during the 1st to the 4th century, the Kabbalists, the mystics, they were trying to achieve the level of the vision of the prophet Ezekiel, prophet Ezekiel Navi. In chapter 1, the prophet Ezekiel describes in detail the throne of God, what we know as the chariot, the vision of the chariot. And he speaks about someone who has the appearance of man who is sitting on a throne, and he speaks about Ophanim, he speaks about angels, and how the throne moves from here to there and has wheels and this and that. There's a lot of these anthropomorphisms in the descriptions of the Navi. And it seems that in this period, the main goal, the main characteristic of the literature of this time, of the secret knowledge that was passed down in this generation, was how to access, how could you experience the vision of the prophet Ezekiel yourself. This was a great mystery, and it's that in this vision there is great mysteries, great secrets, because the vision of Ezekiel, chapter 1, Hezkel Navi, contains the promise that God's special providence would never be withheld from the nation of Israel. No matter what, Hashem will always be with the Jewish people. The vision of the prophet of Hezkel is also a guarantee that prophecy will come back to the Jewish people. And there is always a link within the nation of Israel that we will never ever cut down, because even though there is no prophecy today like in the time of the prophets, there still exist lower levels of prophecy. Later on, we have what we call as a bat kol, a heavenly voice, Ruach HaKodesh, which we have until today. And these are lower levels of prophecy. Even a person that goes to sleep and has a dream and is dreaming, it says that a person that is dreaming, the dream comes true, is as 1/60th of prophecy. Even for a common person, much more for someone who is a Talmid Chacham, someone who is working to purify himself, someone who is working to purify his heart, someone who is working and learning the wisdom of the Kabbalah. We're going to explain this later on, as Chacham Rabbi Moshe Cordovero explains the big difference for someone who learns the hidden wisdom and someone who only learns Peshat, the simple. There's a big difference here. This is something that we will explain later on in a further class when we reach to this great sage, Chacham Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. I want to mention now briefly about other group of Jewish mystics that existed during the 1st century that not many people speak about today, but they were like one of the greatest sages, mystics of that generation. I want to speak briefly about the Essenes, the mystics of Qumran. Who were the mystics of Qumran? Probably you heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you've ever been to Israel, you've been to the Israel National Museum, you probably have seen it, right? The great scroll of Isaiah. You have the sanctuary of the book, and you will see probably there. If you've been to Israel, you'll see it. You see what we call as the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in Qumran, and there is a lot of mystical material there. There's a lot of apocalyptic books, such as the Book of Enoch, and another type of literature that deals specifically with this Jewish community that were very, very particular about their teachings. They didn't accept anybody into the group. They even rejected other Jewish groups at that time. I want to emphasize that during the first century, the Jewish people were divided in different sects, different groups. Not all of the Jews live also in Israel at that time. You have to remember that only a small group came back from Babylon. The majority of the Jews remain in Babylon. There's other Jews living in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, and other parts of the world. They say that at that time there were around 5 million Jews, 1.5, 2 million Jews live in Israel, another million or so live in Babylon, another one, like I said, in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, in different parts of the world. Even in Spain at that time, there were Jewish communities, in France, and we know for sure that there were Jewish communities that date back to the time of Solomon, Shlomo Melech, that were settled and established themselves in Iberia, what is today Spain and Portugal. This is another topic for another video. So, in Judea, what was happening? You have to remember, there was a point in the Jewish history that the nation was attacked by the Greeks. Remember, Alexander the Great came, invaded, took over everything, the whole Middle East. So the Jews were under the power of and the control of the Greeks. At some point, the Jewish nation were allowed to keep their worship, their customs, their beliefs. But later on, there was a lot of persecution. And the Jewish people were persecuted for learning Torah, to doing Brit Milah and other things. And things reached to the point in which the Greeks defiled and did a horrible thing. They went into the temple, the Jewish temple, the most sacred, the heart of the Jewish nation, and they desecrated the temple. They went to the Kodesh HaKodashim, to the Holy of Holies, and they even, the story says that they even sacrificed a pig, an animal that is not kosher, that is impure animal, on the altar. So that infuriated the Jewish nation that was very tired of the Greeks. A lot of persecution at this time, and that's how the whole rebellion of the Maccabees started. You know, the whole story of Judah, Yehuda Maccabi, and his father and the brothers, and the whole Jewish nation rose up in arms against the power of the Seleucid king in Syria, the Syrio-Greco empire at the time. And I have the whole story of the Maccabees. Eventually, the Jewish nation were able to defeat the Greeks, and the temple was rededicated. That's why we have the celebration of Hanukkah, which is the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. Now, once the Maccabees regained the control of Judea, the sages of Israel came and told the leaders of the Maccabees, look, great, we have the nation back. Now we have to find the descendant of David HaMelech, because it says that the one who rules the Jewish people must be a descendant of King David. He is the king of the Jews, because the kingdom of David will be everlasting, forever. What happened? The Maccabees didn't like that suggestion, that request from the sages of Israel. And the Maccabees said, no, we're going to rule the Jewish nation. And that's why the Maccabees started a whole dynasty known as the Hasmonean, the house, they known as the house of the Hasmoneans. These were the different kings that were ruling the Jewish people. Eventually, there was a lot of problem. There was a lot of split and confrontations between Jews in this time, to the point that the Kohanim refused to serve in the temple. They said, we're not going to work for you. You're not doing things right. You are Kohanim, because the Maccabees were Kohanim. You are not supposed to be kings. This is something that belongs to the descendant of King David. So the Kohanim who refused, they said, we're not going to work in the Beit HaMikdash. What happened? The Maccabees sent an army, the Hasmoneans at this time, known as the Hasmoneans. They sent an army, and they massacred a lot of the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. It was a big tragedy, huge tragedy for the Jewish nation. And the remainder of the Kohanim, They flew. They ran away and they went into hiding in the desert. Now the Hasmoneans said, not only we have the kingship, we also have the priesthood. We ourselves are Kohanim, so we're going to appoint our own priest. We're going to appoint our own Kohanim to serve in the Bet HaMikdash. So the Hasmoneans, they had the kingship as the rulers of Judea, and they have the power of the priesthood. They were in charge now. They put their own priest in the Bet HaMikdash. Now the priests who survived and escaped, they went to the desert. They went to Qumran, and eventually they were known as the Essenes, of which Philo of Alexandria, a great rabbi who lived in Egypt, in Alexandria, in the 1st century, he wrote about them. He said there's this group of Jewish mystics who live in the desert. They're very pious, great people. Eventually, historians don't agree to, because it seems that there were different Jewish groups. But in general, we call them the community of Qumran, or the Essenes. And to them is that we attribute the authorship of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when we found what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, that basically is just the whole Tanakh. We have apocalyptic literature. We have the Book of Enoch. For the first time in history, we were able to find what is known as apocryphal text. Apocryphal means hidden. Doesn't mean false. It means hidden. And we found for the first time ever the original version of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic. So far, the only version that we had was a translation into Ethiopic. Amharic is known, of the Book of Enoch, that later on was translated to Greek, to Latin, to Spanish, and to other languages. But we have, for the first time with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I forgot now the specific date that they were discovered, in the 60s, I think. 40-something, 60s, I think. For the first time, we have a copy of the Book of Enoch in the original Aramaic. We have also a lot of the texts of the community. There's something known as the rule of the community. We have the Copper Scroll. We have different texts that deal with this mystical community of the Essenes. This was a group of Jewish mystics that was completely separated from everything, from society. They were against other Jews. They said there was a lot of corruption in the temple. There was a lot of problems happening. Remember that this time the Jewish people were divided between Saddukim, the Sadducees, and the Prushim, the Pharisees, the Chazal, our sages, and there were other groups, and there was a whole groups also that later on became Christians, and a lot of things were happening during those days. So the Essenes, the community of Qumran, was one of those Jewish groups during the 1st century, but we have the characteristic that it was a mystical group. They believe that there was an imminent destruction that was about to take place, and that God will send angels to protect them, because they believe we are the chosen ones. Even the other Jews, they are not holy as we are holy. And if there is someone that is chosen, this is us, the Essenes. And he says there is other Jews who are corrupt. They're gonna be destroyed. And there's a lot of corruption in the temple. We know that from the Sadducees, who were traitors, who sided with the Romans and were doing a lot of things there. So the Essenes believe that God will send legions of angels to protect them, and there was a duality in them. They believed there was a fight, there was the war between the forces of evil and the forces of good, the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. Of course, they believed they were on the side of light. And eventually we know that during the first Jewish war against the Roman Empire, between 66 to 70, or 73 if you want to count Masada, 3 more years, the community of Qumran was destroyed completely. Everything, it seems that they themselves, according to the opinion of Professor Adolfo Reutemann, who is the one in charge of taking care of the Dead Sea Scrolls here in Israel, here in Jerusalem, it seems to be that they destroy a lot of their own scrolls. That way the manuscripts will not fall into the hands of the enemy. And it seems that the Romans, they went into persecution, and they went after whatever the Jews were hiding, they went after them. They went into the desert, they went into caves. You know the history of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the 70 CE. So with the destruction that happened, the community of the Essenes, the community of Qumran also disappear. And those who probably escape, eventually they join with the rest, with the remainder of the Jewish people, who eventually were not allowed to stay in Jerusalem, but they were in other parts of Judea, other parts of the Holy Land. There's another story, Bersat Hashem, another video, what happened during this time, how the Roman emperor eventually later on in a different time they keep oppressing, and there was a second Jewish war from 132 to 135. That's the time of Rabbi Akiva. But okay, this is the topic for another video. But basically, I just want to emphasize that the community of Qumran disappeared. But disappears a community, but those who survive, they went to join the other survivors, the other group of the Jewish people. And it seems like this knowledge was passed down also within the Jewish nation, as those who survived Qumran also passed this knowledge to all the sages, to all the rabbis, to the Chamim, and they themselves were sages, great masters of the Jewish nation. So this is briefly what happened, and during this time, the community of Qumran is defined as a very, very messianic community in the sense that they believe that the coming of Mashiach was mamash imminent. But they literally believe that there were legions of angels that will come down, they will fight for them, and they will kill the Romans, and all the corruption that was taking place during that time will come to an end. So basically, this is briefly resuming or speaking about the different Jewish groups during the first century, the different communities, some of the main texts about what was happening during this time. B'ezrat Hashem, in the next video, in the next class, we are going to continue now what happened after this period, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into looking into this literature at the time. As I mentioned, the Echalot Ravate, Echalot Sutartei, the different texts that were taking place in this time. We're going to speak about the period of the Geonim, because there's a development of the Kabbalah that now the center of knowledge was shifting. And it was shifting from Judea to Babylon, to Syria, to Yemen, to different communities. B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to speak about it in the next class, in the next video. We're going to look into deeper details about what were the Jewish mystics doing during this time. What were the Kabbalists of the time? They were not yet called Kabbalists. They were known as the Maskilim or the Merkava, as I explained before. But what were the Jewish mystics doing during this time? What was the literature what were the books that they were learning, right? Because I have to also, before I finish, to explain something. I said before that there are two major themes in the learning of the Kabbalah. You have the Maase Bereshit and the Maase Merkava. But doesn't mean that someone who was a mystic, who was a Kabbalist, knew all of these secrets altogether. No. There were different schools of knowledge. There were those who were only experts in the Maase Bereshit, but didn't know Maase Merkava. And there were those who knew Maase Merkava and didn't know Maase Bereshit. It was a later period, because of different historical circumstances and tragedies that happened to the Jewish nation, that all of this knowledge was put together. And eventually, with time, new books that were hidden were revealed. You have to remember there were different schools, and so it was the school of Rabbi Hillel, the school of Rabbi Shammai, and they received different tradition from different rabbis. Therefore, you have also a group of people who learn from different schools. So they were able to integrate a lot of knowledge from different masters of the Jewish people during this time. So in the beginning, again, there were different schools. Each one possessed a secret that didn't share with the other school. There was a big difference here. And it was a later time in which this knowledge was combined. This is very important to explain. So to have a context of what we're going to explain of the development of the Kabbalah in a later period. B'ezrat Hashem. I want to thank you all for your attention. You're welcome to leave your comments if you would like me to continue with these classes. I think it's going to be very beneficial to a lot of people in the English-speaking world who would like to know more about it. I want to thank you so much. B'ezrat Hashem, sending you blessings, a lot of berachot from the holy city of Jerusalem, from Israel. May the Almighty bless you all. Thank you for watching, and B'ezrat Hashem, we'll see each other in the next class. Shalom.